Well, you can see from the screen that it's time for our monthly What is Written study. And here is our first question, and this will take all of our time, I think, and then some perhaps. How were the Nephilim on the earth before and after the flood? Well, open your Bibles to Genesis chapter 6. And I want to read the first 4 verses to kind of set the scene for our study this morning. Moses writes, "Now it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown." Well, the questioner calls our attention to Genesis chapter 6 and verse 4. And we just read that passage, but then also Numbers chapter 13 and verse 33. Now, Numbers 13 is talking about the report of the 10 spies, or the 12 spies, when they came back after spying out the land of Canaan. And the 10 spies told Israel, "There we saw the giants. The descendants of Anak came from the giants, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight." The term that is translated giants in Genesis 6 verse 4 is the Hebrew word Nephilim, and then you've got that same word once again 2 different times in Numbers chapter 13 and verse 33. Now, do you see the potential difficulty? Genesis 6:4 mentions the Nephilim, and then that term is used again in Numbers 13:33. The question is, how did the Nephilim survive the flood? Remember what happened in the flood? Well, that's really the heart of our question this morning. Let me point out that the term Nephilim is translated giants in the Old King James, the New King James. In Young's literal translation, it's translated fallen ones. All of the other English translations that I checked, and I had them listed on the chart, they don't really translate the word, they transliterate the word. In other words, they bring the Hebrew word into and give it an English spelling. For example, our English word baptize really is a transliteration of the Greek word baptizo. That's the verb form. The noun baptism is a transliteration of the Greek noun baptisma. Well, many believe that the translation giants is really an interpretive translation influenced by Numbers 13, verse 33. That means that there may be some question about whether or not the Nephilim actually were giants. The etymology of this word is uncertain. Some believe that it came from the Hebrew word naphal, which means to fall, so they would be the fallen ones, but there's questions about whether we're talking about fallen angels, morally fallen men, warriors who fall upon others in battle, those who fell by the sword, those who fall before them in fear. Others believe that it comes from the Hebrew word nephil, meaning miscarriage. So the term would suggest we're talking about odd-looking people who survived preterm delivery, or ghosts or spirits of miscarriages. Some believe it came from a different Hebrew word meaning extraordinary, and so the term means extraordinary men. We're just not sure about the meaning of the term Nephilim. So what are the facts? Well, we're going to summarize what we're told in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. That passage tells us that the sons of God married the daughters of men. It says that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. In other words, the daughters of men bore children to the sons of God, and these children were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Well, the Old Testament very clearly teaches that all humans died in the flood except Noah and his family. I'm not going to take the time to look at the statements in the book of Genesis, but I want you to look at 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 5, where Peter says, well, let me back up to verse 4. For if God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them down to hell, and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved for judgment, and did not spare the ancient world, but saved Noah, one of 8 people, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood on the world of the ungodly. That passage clearly indicates that the only survivors of the flood were Noah and his family. Look at Genesis chapter 9, verse 18 and 19, where the record says, Now the sons of Noah who went out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and Ham was the father of Canaan. These 3 were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was populated. So that text tells us that the world was repopulated with humans from the sons of Noah. Therefore, all who lived after the flood were the descendants of either Shem, Ham, or Japheth. We've already noted from Numbers 13 that the Nephilim existed after the flood. So, what would we conclude based upon the information so far? Well, it would seem that the logical conclusion would be that the Nephilim descended from Noah's sons and their wives. Again, the spies reported that there were Nephilim in the land of Canaan when they went in to spy out the land. Deuteronomy also talks about various groups of giants, the Anakim, the Rephaim, the Emim, the Zamzummim, that lived in Canaan before, during, and after the conquest. So really, there are at least 3 questions that I think we need to consider. First of all, who were the sons of God and who were the daughters of men, mentioned in Genesis 6, verse 2. And then, of course, who were the Nephilim? Or to ask the question in a slightly different way, were the Nephilim the progeny of their marriages or merely contemporaries? And of course, this is the main question that I've been asked, and that is, how did the Nephilim survive the flood. Were the Nephilim the progeny of the sons of God marrying the daughters of men, or were they merely contemporaries? In other words, did the Nephilim live at the same time? Notice what the Lexham Research Commentary has to say about this. They write, the difficulty with the view is that the syntax of the text does not directly link Genesis 6:4 to Genesis 6:2. So it is unclear that the Nephilim resulted from the commingling of the sons of God and daughters of humankind. Now, to maybe state that in a little bit simpler form, Genesis 6:4 does not clearly say that the Nephilim were the progeny of the mixed marriages. I think the language could allow that conclusion, but I don't know that the language demands that conclusion. So, who were the Nephilim? Well, there are those who argue that they were the offspring of angels and humans. In other words, they were the progeny of the sons of God, understood to be fallen angels, and the daughters of men, human women. Some have argued that the Nephilim were mighty men of renown, but merely human. In other words, they were the progeny of the sons of God, understood to be the Sethites, and the daughters of men, understood to be the Cainites. That would mean, if this conclusion is correct, that they were not the progeny of the sons of God and the daughters of men, but rather their contemporaries. If you notice the text carefully, we are told that the Nephilim were in existence before and after the sons of God married the daughters of men. Some have even argued that the Nephilim were the sons of God themselves. In other words, that they were one and the same. And then others have argued that they were contemporaries, a group of people living on the earth at the time that the sons of God married the daughters of men. In other words, the reference to the Nephilim in Genesis 6:4 is merely a temporal notation, a note telling us that when the sons of God married the daughters of men, the Nephilim were in existence both before that happened and afterwards. So, to our question, how do we explain the existence of the Nephilim after the flood? Well, various explanations have been offered. Some have suggested that Noah's flood was regional, not global. Well, I just don't think that's correct. I don't think that can be correct at all, because the Old Testament and the New Testament, I think, clearly indicates that the flood was global. Now, we can't take the time to look at the passages that you see on the chart, but I will take you to 2 Peter 3. Notice verse 5 and 6. Peter says, "For this," these skeptics who are questioning the second coming of Jesus, "for this they willfully forget that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of water and in the water. I think that's a reference to the initial creation. Verse 6, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. Well, I think that's a clear reference to the flood in the days of Noah. Well, if the world in verse 5 is the globe, that same world is mentioned in verse 6, and we're told that it perished, being flooded with water. I think that's a clear indication that the flood was global. So I don't think this explanation will work. Some have suggested that Noah was one of the Nephilim. This idea is floated, you might say, in the Genesis Apocryphon. Others have suggested, as I have already suggested, that the Nephilim descended from Noah's sons and their wives. Now, as crazy as this sounds, it has been suggested that one of the Nephilim somehow survived the flood, that he kind of hung on to the ark and Noah kind of fed him. That idea is found in the Babylonian Talmud in the section Zevahim 113. Now, if you think that's crazy, I agree with you, all right? I'm just telling you that idea has been suggested. Some have also argued that the later reference to the Nephilim in Numbers 13, verse 33, is a gloss. In other words, it wasn't in the original text. It was added later by scribes. That suggestion is based on the fact that the Septuagint omits any reference to the Nephilim in Numbers 13, verse 33. Some have suggested that other sons of God cohabited with the daughters of men again after the flood. And they argue that the word when in verse 4 could be translated whenever. Mike Heiser, in his book The Unseen Realm, makes that argument. Others have suggested that when the spies come back and they tell Israel, we saw the Nephilim there, that was an instance of dramatic hyperbole, that they're kind of exaggerating their report. Well, I don't think that works either, because earlier in the text, 3 Anakim are named by Moses in verse 22, and also in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses confirms this report. Again, we can't take the time to read these passages. If you're taking notes, you might jot them down and you can look at those at your leisure. Well, what about this idea that the word when in verse 4, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, that it could be translated whenever? Well, it's the Hebrew word asher. That's my best effort at correct pronunciation. Notice what Jacinius says in his Hebrew grammar. He says the word is used to express actions, etc., which were repeated in the past, either at fixed intervals or occasionally. And notice that he lists Genesis 6:4 as an example of the word being used in this way. John Skinner, in his commentary, makes this observation. The idea undoubtedly is that this race arose at that time in consequence of the union of the divine spirit with human flesh, and also afterwards, whenever the sons of the gods came in, and they, the women, bore unto them. That is to say, the production of Nephilim was not confined to the remote period indicated by verse 1 and following, but was continued in after ages through visits of angels to mortal wives. All right. So this commentator believes that there were other sons of God who cohabited with the daughters of men after the flood, and that explains how the Nephilim survived the flood. It has also been suggested that the giants in Canaan, Numbers 13:33, came to be called the Nephilim by analogy with the earlier mighty men. To say that maybe in a slightly different way, the idea is that the term Nephilim refers to two different groups of giants. The International Standard Bible Encyclopedia says the mention that there were Nephilim later does not imply that they survived the flood, but rather that the name lived on for men of great stature and strength, as in Numbers 13:33. Are you following the argument? Basically, they're suggesting that the term Nephilim is applied to a different group of giants. Well, as you can see, several different explanations have been proffered. I believe that some of them are absolutely ridiculous and must be rejected out of hand. I believe some of them are possible, but unlikely. The correct explanation may be unknowable for us today. But, and I think this is the most important point that I'm making at this juncture, there is a correct explanation. We may not know for sure which explanation is correct. Were the Nephilim the descendants of Noah's sons and their wives? Or did other sons of God cohabit with the daughters of men after the flood? Or is it that the term Nephilim is applied to a different set of giants? We may not know for sure which explanation is the correct explanation. But I believe there is a correct explanation. And that means there's no contradiction in Scripture that has been proven. Now then, what about the sons of God and the daughters of men? Well, different explanations have been offered down through the centuries. Again, I think some of them are rather absurd. Some have suggested that the sons of God were extraterrestrial visitors, for example. Some have suggested that the sons of God were a pre-Adamic remnant. But the New Testament teaches that Adam was the first man, so I think that's ridiculous. Some have suggested that the sons of God were royalty, royal rulers who married commoners, common women. My guess is that the most popular explanation today, at least among brethren, is that the sons of God is a reference to the godly Sethites, the descendants of Seth, who were godly. And the daughters of men is a reference to the ungodly Cainites, ungodly descendants of Cain. And then another explanation, in fact, this was the earliest explanation that was widely accepted until the time of Augustine in the 4th century A.D., is that the sons of God is a reference to fallen angels marrying women. Let me point out that there are several things that Genesis 6, 1 through 4 does not explicitly say. The text does not explicitly say that the sons of God were angels or Sethites or royalty. Those conclusions are inferences that people have drawn. But the text doesn't explicitly identify who the sons of God were. The same thing is true concerning the daughters of men. The text does not explicitly tell us that they were women, that they were Cainites, the descendants of Cain, or that they were commoners. When we are told that the sons of God took wives among the daughters of men, that does not explicitly say that these marriages were forced, that the women were compelled to marry against their will. In fact, the word took is commonly used as a Hebrew idiom to describe what happens when people marry. When the text speaks of all whom they chose, some have argued that that means that these sons of God were guilty of polygamy. But the text doesn't explicitly say that. That is a conclusion that people have drawn from the text. Also notice that the Nephilim are not explicitly said to be the progeny of mixed marriages between the sons of God and the daughters of men. And also, the text does not explicitly say that the Nephilim were the mighty men. And I'm out of time. And I know you want more information. At least I would hope you would want more information. And so we will pursue that either next Sunday, or I'll wait till the next What Is Written study. I'll decide that. But we need to talk about, okay, who are the sons of God and who are the daughters of men. Certainly, if you have any questions based on what I've shared with you this morning, I'll be happy to talk with you privately. Again, as I've already said, we really need to kind of explore the identity of the sons of God and the daughters of men further. Thank you for your very kind attention. The thing that I want you to take home with you or walk away with is even though there might appear to be a contradiction between Genesis 6:4 that speaks of the Nephilim and Numbers 13 that speaks of the Nephilim again, well, how could that be if everybody died in the flood? Well, that alleged contradiction has not been proven. I hope that I've demonstrated that there are several possible explanations. Thank you.